This is the story of terror that no one survived to tell. The old Ford groaned as it climbed the coastal road, a sound of metal fatigue that had become the trip's monotonous soundtrack. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee, cheap gas station snacks, and the easy nostalgia of four people who had known each other for a third of their lives. Liam gripped the wheel, his knuckles white on the worn leather. He was the planner, the anchor, the one who had herded them all together for this 10-year reunion. A decade since they had thrown their caps in the air and promised to stay in touch. A promise that had eroded with jobs, marriages, and the simple, grinding passage of time. "Are you sure this is the right way, man?" Ben's voice boomed from the passenger seat, jarring Liam from his thoughts. Ben was built like a retired linebacker, with a personality to match, loud, perpetually amused, and armed with a skepticism that bordered on religious devotion. "My phone lost signal about an hour ago. For all we know, you are leading us to some backwoods cult. They are going to harvest our organs and make artisanal wallets." From the back, Chloe snorted, not looking up from the ancient, leather-bound book in her lap. "Do not be so dramatic, Ben. And they would not want your organs. Too much cheap beer and pizza." Chloe was the group's resident academic, a history postgraduate with a love for forgotten places and their morbid little stories. This trip had been her idea, a suggestion she had made half-jokingly that Liam had latched onto with desperate sincerity. Beside her, Maya was silent, her forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window. She was watching the world outside blur into a smear of grey and green. Maya was an artist, a painter of unsettling, beautiful landscapes. She saw the world in textures and light, and felt it in ways the others could not comprehend. She had not said much since they left the city, lost in a quiet that seemed deeper than her usual introspection. "It is the right way," Liam said, his voice tight with forced confidence. The rental instructions were specific: follow the coast road until it ends. You cannot miss it. Famous last words, Ben muttered, popping open a can of soda with a loud hiss. The road was narrowing, the asphalt cracking and giving way to gravel. Gnarled, wind-whipped trees clawed at the sides of the car. The sky, a cheerful blue an hour ago, had curdled into a uniform, oppressive sheet of grey. The air itself seemed to change, growing heavy and thick with the smell of salt and wet stone. And then they saw it. It rose from the headland like a jagged bone, a stark white pillar against the bruised sky. The Salt Weeper's Spire. Even from a distance, it looked wrong, forsaken. It was not the proud, stoic sentinel of nautical lore. It was a tombstone marking the edge of the world. A keeper's cottage, little more than a stone box, huddled at its base, looking as though it were trying to shrink away from the tower it served. Liam pulled the car to a stop where the gravel road dissolved into weeds and mud. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind, a low, mournful moan that snaked around the car. It was not the clean, brisk wind of the coast. It felt old and tired, carrying a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Well," Chloe finally breathed, her eyes wide with a mixture of academic thrill and primal unease. "It is atmospheric. It is, A dump, Ben declared, but his usual bluster lacked its conviction. He was staring at the lighthouse, his jaw tight. "You are telling me we are staying in that thing for a week? It will be an adventure," Liam said, trying to sound enthusiastic. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. The wind's moan became more distinct, a keening lament that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They got out of the car, the doors thudding shut with a sound that felt unnervingly final. The air was cold, biting at their exposed skin. It carried that smell, salt and damp earth, but something else too. Something metallic and faintly sweet, like flowers left to rot in a vase. "Smells weird," Maya whispered, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. It was the first thing she had said in an hour. She was looking at the cottage, her artist's eye tracing the dark, water-stained streaks that ran down the stone walls like tears. A large rusted key was waiting for them under a loose stone by the door, just as the email had promised. The lock protested with a screech of tortured metal before the heavy wooden door swung inward, opening into darkness. Liam fumbled for a light switch, his fingers finding a cold, greasy toggle. A single, bare bulb flickered to life, casting a jaundiced, buzzing glow over the main room of the keeper's cottage. It was one large space, combining a kitchen and living area. A thick layer of dust coated everything, muting the colors of a threadbare rug and two sagging armchairs. A stone fireplace gaped like a black mouth on the far wall, filled with the charred remains of a long-dead fire. The air inside was still and frigid, colder than it was outside, and the strange, cloying smell was stronger here. "Charming," Ben said, his voice echoing slightly in the oppressive quiet. He dropped his duffel bag on the floor, raising a small cloud of dust. "Got that rustic, you're about to be murdered vibe. I love it." While Ben and Liam started hauling their gear in from the car, Chloe gravitated toward a small built-in bookshelf. Her fingers, delicate and pale, traced the spines of the few books that remained. Most were technical manuals on lens maintenance and maritime charts, but one was a thick, ledger-style book bound in dark, cracked leather. "Oh, look at this," she said, her voice hushed with reverence. "A keeper's log." She carried it over to the dusty dining table and carefully opened it. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with neat, spidery script detailing weather patterns, passing ships, and fuel consumption. Maya, meanwhile, had not moved from the doorway. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, her gaze fixed on the archway that led from the cottage directly into the base of the lighthouse tower. It was a moor of perfect darkness. "What is wrong, May?" Liam asked, setting a box of groceries on the grimy countertop. Maya shivered, though the air had not moved. "I do not know. This place, it feels heavy. Like the air is full of memories." Liam walked over and put a reassuring arm around her shoulders. "It is just an old, spooky place. We will have a fire going in no time. Open some wine. It will be fine." She leaned into him, but he could feel the tension in her small frame. Her eyes were still locked on that dark archway. Later, as the last of the sullen afternoon light began to fade, they started to explore. Ben, armed with a powerful flashlight, declared he was going to inspect their creepy stone prison. Chloe was still engrossed in the logbook, occasionally murmuring about barometric pressure and coal deliveries. Liam and Maya decided to tackle the tower. Stepping through the archway was like crossing a threshold into another world. The air grew instantly colder, and the silence was absolute, broken only by their own breathing. A spiral staircase, forged from black iron, clung to the curved stone wall, ascending up into the gloom. "I do not like this," Maya whispered, her voice barely a sound. "We are just looking," Liam said softly, taking her hand. Her skin was like ice. He switched on his phone's flashlight, the beam cutting a weak cone through the profound darkness. Dust motes, ancient and undisturbed, danced in the light like tiny ghosts. They began to climb. The iron steps rang with each footfall, the sound swallowed by the immense hollow space. The walls were cold and damp to the touch, weeping a thin film of moisture that smelled of brine and deep earth. With every rotation, the small windows offered glimpses of the roiling grey sea, each one seeming higher and more perilous than the last. Halfway up, Maya stopped dead. She pulled her hand from Liam's, her breath catching in her throat. "What is it?" he asked, turning back. She was staring at a section of the wall, her face pale in the phone's glow. "Did you feel that?" "Feel what?" A vibration, a hum." She reached out a trembling hand and pressed it flat against the cold, damp stone. "There, I can feel it." "Cannot you?" Liam placed his own hand on the wall. He closed his eyes, concentrating, trying to filter out the distant sound of the waves and the faint whistling of the wind. At first, there was nothing, just cold, hard stone. But then, as he pressed harder, he felt it. A low, deep thrumming, so subtle it was more a feeling in his bones than a sound in his ears. It was a steady, resonant frequency, as if some massive, unseen engine were running deep within the foundations of the rock itself. "It is probably just the wind," he said, pulling his hand away quickly. The explanation sounded thin and hollow even to him. The shape of the tower, it must create some kind of weird resonance. Maya did not look convinced. She kept her hand on the wall for a moment longer, her expression one of deep, troubled listening. "It does not feel like the wind," she said, her voice distant. "It feels alive." They continued their climb in silence. The hum, once felt, was impossible to ignore. It was a constant, unnerving presence at the edge of their senses. They finally reached the top, emerging into the lantern room. It was a cage of glass and iron, commanding a breathtaking, terrifying view of the churning sea and the endless empty horizon. The great lens, a beautiful, complex hive of glass prisms, sat dormant in the center, coated in a fine layer of grime. Liam ran his flashlight over it, and the dust-filled prisms scattered the beam into 1,000 fractured rainbows. He walked over to a heavy iron door that led to the narrow walkway circling the outside of the lantern. He pulled on the handle. It was stuck fast. A thick, rusted iron latch was thrown across it, solidly in its housing. "Well, no late-night strolls out here," he joked, his voice sounding small in the vast, glassed-in space. As he turned to go, something caught his eye through the grimy glass. A flicker of movement on the jagged black rocks at the base of the cliff. He squinted, trying to focus. It looked like a piece of driftwood, perhaps, or a seal. He moved to a cleaner pane of glass, wiping it with his sleeve. He stared down into the churning chaos of white foam and black rock. There was nothing there, just the sea, endlessly crashing against the shore. He shook his head, blaming the strange light and the distorting glass. A trick of the eye. Down in the cottage, a fire was roaring in the hearth, throwing dancing orange light across the room and pushing back some of the oppressive chill. Ben was in the kitchen area, noisily making sandwiches, his earlier apprehensions seemingly forgotten. Chloe was at the table, a frown of concentration on her face as she hunched over the keeper's logbook. "Find anything interesting?" Liam asked, trying to shake off the lingering unease from the tower. "It is mostly mundane," she said, tapping a long, elegant finger on a page. "Weather, maintenance, supply shipments, all written by a man named Alistair Finch. He was the keeper here for almost 30 years, from 1923 to 1951, but the last few entries, they are different. The neat, disciplined script that filled the preceding pages had devolved into a frantic, almost illegible scrawl. The entries were no longer dated. The ink was blotched and smeared in places, as if written with a trembling hand. What does it say? It is hard to make out. He talks about the singing stone and the weeping walls. He mentions a constant noise, a hum that would not let him sleep, and he keeps drawing this. She pointed to a symbol, drawn over and over again in the margins, a spiral that coiled tightly in on itself. Liam felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He glanced over at Maya, who had taken out her sketchbook and a piece of charcoal. She was sitting in one of the armchairs by the fire, her head bent in concentration, her hand moving swiftly across the page. "He seemed to be losing his mind," Chloe continued, her voice a clinical whisper. "The very last entry is just 3 words." She paused for dramatic effect. "She is still weeping." A log in the fireplace shifted and collapsed, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. In the sudden flare of light, Liam saw what Maya was drawing. Her page was covered in them. Dozens of small, urgent spirals, all coiling in on themselves, identical to the ones in the keeper's logbook. He opened his mouth to say something, but Ben's voice cut through the tension. "Dinner is served, my little ghost hunters. Tuna melts and existential dread. Get them while they are hot." They ate mostly in silence, the crackling of the fire and the rising howl of the wind outside filling the space between them. A storm was rolling in, just as the forecast had predicted. Rain began to lash against the small, thick windows of the cottage, driven by a furious wind. The sounds of the storm were immense, a symphony of nature's rage. The crash of waves against the rocks below was a percussive, deafening roar, and yet, somehow, Liam could still feel it. That low, resonant hum, a constant bass note beneath the storm's chaotic melody. To break the grim silence, Ben started telling stories from their college days. He was a gifted storyteller, and soon he had them laughing, the oppressive atmosphere of the cottage momentarily forgotten. They were just 4 old friends again, hiding from a storm fortified by wine and shared memories. "All right," Ben said, wiping a tear of laughter from his eye. "Since we are in a haunted-ass lighthouse, who has a ghost story. Do not, Maya said, her voice small but firm. Oh, come on, Maya, Ben cajoled. Live a little, or, die a little. Whatever is appropriate. Chloe, ever the academic, cleared her throat. Actually, she began, the local history archives I was reading online mentioned a legend about this place. They called it the Sorrow of the Spire. Ben leaned forward, his elbows on the table, a smirk on his face. Ooh, spooky. Do tell. It is just a local folk tale, Chloe said, though her eyes glinted with excitement. It claims one of the early keepers had a wife and a young son. One day the boy was playing on the rocks and a rogue wave took him. It swept him out to sea. They never found the body. The wife, driven mad with grief, supposedly threw herself from the lantern gallery a week later. The legend says her sorrow was so immense that it could not dissipate, that it soaked into the stones of the tower, and that on stormy nights you can still hear her weeping. Bunk, Ben declared, draining his wineglass. Sad story, sure, but ghosts. Come on. It is just stories people tell to scare kids. As if on cue, it happened. It was a sound that cut through the roar of the storm like a shard of glass. A single, definitive metallic bang that echoed down the spiral staircase from the very top of the lighthouse. It was not the sound of the wind. It was not the groan of an old building settling. It was the sharp, percussive clang of a heavy door being slammed shut. Silence fell over the room. 4 pairs of eyes stared at the dark archway leading to the tower. Ben's smirk was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed stillness. Maya let out a small, terrified gasp. Liam's heart hammered against his ribs. What the hell was that? Ben whispered, his voice stripped of all its earlier bravado. The door, Liam stammered, his mind racing back to the lantern room, the door to the walkway. But it was latched, rusted shut. I could not even budge it. Maybe the wind broke the latch. Ben offered, but his voice was thin, unconvincing. He was trying to rationalize, to force the terrifying unknown back into a box of mundane explanation. No, Liam said, shaking his head. No way. That latch was solid iron. The wind could not. He trailed off. They all stared at the archway, at the darkness that seemed to be actively pouring out of it, a cold, silent flood. Ben pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the stone floor. He stood up, puffing out his chest in a transparent display of false courage. All right, I am going up there to see what that was. Ben, no, Maya pleaded, her voice trembling. Do not go up there. I am not going to sit down here cowering because an old building made a noise, he said, grabbing the heavy flashlight from the mantelpiece. It is the wind. It has to be. Liam stood up. As the planner, the one who had brought them here, a crushing weight of responsibility settled on him. I am coming with you. Liam, do not, Chloe said, her face ashen. The legends and scribbled warnings in the logbook were no longer a source of academic curiosity. They were real, and they were terrifying. We will be fine, Liam said, his voice a low murmur meant to reassure them, and himself. We will just go up, close the door, and come right back down. He grabbed his phone, his hands slick with sweat. Together, he and Ben stepped through the archway, leaving the warm, fire-lit sanctuary of the cottage behind. They were immediately swallowed by the cold and the dark of the tower. Ben's flashlight beam sliced through the blackness, painting a frantic, bouncing circle on the damp stone walls as they began to climb. The ascent was a nightmare. The roar of the storm outside was muted by the thick stone, but inside new sounds emerged. The rhythmic humming was louder now, a palpable vibration that seemed to make their teeth ache, and beneath it, another sound, a faint rhythmic dripping. Drip, 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 drip. It was slow and steady, like a leaking faucet, but it seemed to come from the walls themselves. The air grew colder with every step, a biting, unnatural cold that sank deep into their bones. The smell of decay was overpowering now, a stomach-turning miasma of old brine and something sickeningly sweet. "I hate this," Ben breathed, his voice tight. His flashlight beam trembled. "I really, really hate this." They reached the final turn of the staircase and stepped into the lantern room. The wind shrieked like a banshee. The heavy iron door to the walkway was wide open, swinging back and forth in the gale, slamming against its frame with thunderous metallic crashes. Rain and sea spray drove into the room, soaking the iron floor. "See?" Ben shouted over the din. "The latch must have rusted through. The wind blew it open." They fought their way across the room, the wind trying to push them back. They grabbed the heavy door, the iron so cold it felt like it was burning their skin. It took all their combined strength to pull it against the force of the storm. As they struggled, Liam glanced through the open doorway. The world outside was a maelstrom of black sky and white water. And then he saw it, on the jagged rocks far below, illuminated for a split second by a distant flash of lightning, stood a figure. It was tall and unnaturally thin, a stark silhouette of absolute blackness against the raging sea. It was perfectly still, seemingly unaffected by the hurricane-force winds and the crashing waves that exploded into foam at its feet. It had no discernible features, no face, no clothes, just a void in the shape of a person. And it was looking up, right at them. A scream caught in Liam's throat. He felt a terror so pure and profound it threatened to stop his heart. "Ben, look," he choked out, his voice torn away by the wind. "What?" "I cannot hear you. Help me with this damn door." Liam tore his eyes away from the terrifying figure and threw his shoulder against the iron door. He risked one last glance down. The rocks were empty. There was nothing there but the violent, indifferent sea. With a final, desperate heave, they managed to slam the door shut. Ben fumbled with the latch, his fingers numb and clumsy. The original iron housing was shattered, pieces of rusted metal littering the floor. But the bolt itself was intact. He forced it into a secondary bracket, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. The room was suddenly, blessedly quieter, the roar of the storm reduced to a muffled howl. They stood there for a long moment, leaning against the cold iron door, chests heaving, the adrenaline singing in their veins. "Did you see that?" Liam finally managed to say, his voice a raw whisper. "See what?" Ben asked, wiping rain from his face. All I saw was a broken latch and a whole lot of rain. I told you it was the wind. Liam stared at him, at his friend's determinedly rational face, and he knew. He knew that what he had seen on the rocks was not the wind. It was not a trick of the light, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him more than any storm that they were not alone in this forsaken place. The reunion was over. A nightmare that began on an ordinary day had just begun. When they returned to the cottage, the warmth from the fire felt like a distant memory from another lifetime. Liam stumbled in first, his face a mask of waxy, rain-slicked terror. Ben followed, slamming the door to the tower archway behind them with a shuddering boom that made the women jump. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed, but he forced a wide, unconvincing grin. "Problem solved," he announced, his voice too loud, too cheerful. Latch was busted, just like I said. The wind was knocking the door around. All fixed. Chloe and Maya were huddled together on the sofa, wrapped in a single blanket, their eyes wide and dark in the flickering firelight. They stared at the two men, searching their faces for an explanation that made sense, for reassurance that the world was still sane. "That is it?" Chloe asked, her voice a skeptical whisper. "Just the wind. Just the wind," Ben confirmed, stripping off his wet jacket and throwing it over a chair. "This old pile of rocks just groans a lot in a storm. Nothing to worry about." Liam did not say anything. He walked numbly to the fireplace and held his trembling hands out to the flames, seeking a warmth that could not reach the chill that had settled deep in his marrow. He could still see it, burned onto the backs of his eyelids, the impossible, ink-black figure standing serene amidst the ocean's fury. Maya's gaze shifted from Ben's false bravado to Liam's silent, shaking form. "Liam," she whispered, "what did you see?" He flinched as if she had struck him. He could not tell them. How could he? They would think he was losing his mind. Ben would mock him. Chloe would try to rationalize it. And Maya... He did not want to give her fear a shape. He did not want to confirm the dread that already clung to her like a shroud. "Nothing," he lied, his voice hoarse. "Ben is right. It was just the storm." The lie hung in the air, thick and foul. Maya knew he was not telling the truth. He could see it in her eyes. The connection they shared, an unspoken understanding that had always been part of their friendship, was now a conduit for shared terror. No one suggested telling more stories. No one offered more wine. The failed attempt at manufactured fun was over, its flimsy structure shattered by a single, inexplicable sound. The four of them sat in the suffocating silence of the small cottage, listening. They listened to the rage of the storm, the howl of the wind, the percussive crash of the waves. But they were listening for something else too. They were listening for the house, for the hum in its stones, for the weeping in its walls, for the next sound that would defy all logic. Sleep was a laughable impossibility. They agreed to stay in the main room together, not trusting the two small, cold bedrooms that branched off the main living area. Ben took one armchair, Liam the other, while Chloe and Maya shared the lumpy sofa. They dragged mattresses onto the floor, a miserable adult slumber party born of fear. but no one slept. Every creak of the old structure, every shriek of the wind, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through their exhausted bodies. Hours crawled by. The fire burned down to a sullen, pulsing bed of embers, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed and danced on the stone walls. In the dim red glow, everything looked menacing. A coat slung over a chair became a hunched figure. The dark maw of the unlit kitchen was a pit of infinite blackness. It was Maya who heard it first. She sat bolt upright, pulling the blanket tight to her chin. "Do you hear that?" "Hear what?" Ben grumbled from his chair, his voice thick with exhaustion. "I hear a hurricane, in case you had not noticed." "No, it is underneath the wind," she insisted, her head cocked. "It is a crying sound, like a woman weeping." Liam strained his ears, holding his breath. He filtered out the low roar of the waves and the high-pitched whistle of the wind as it tore past the eaves. And then he heard it. It was faint. So faint he thought he might be imagining it. A high, thin thread of sound, unbearably sad. It wove in and out of the storm's chaos, a pure, unending note of grief. "I hear it," he whispered, and the admission felt like a betrayal. Chloe was listening intently, her brow furrowed. "It is the wind," she said, her voice lacking conviction. "Air currents moving through a crack in a window pane, or maybe the chimney flue. It can create acoustic phenomena that sound like voices." "It does not sound like the wind," Maya said, her voice shaking. "It sounds like she is in pain." Ben let out an exasperated sigh. "Oh, for God's sake, it is the sorrow of the Spire, right? Chloe, you put the idea in her head with your ghost story. It is mass hysteria." "Power of suggestion. I am not suggesting it." Liam snapped, his nerves frayed. "I can hear it too, Ben." Ben stared at him, his expression hardening. "Then you are letting this place get to you, man. It is just an old house making old house noises." The argument died, leaving a bitter residue of anger and division in the air. They were splitting into factions, believers and skeptics, the scared and the stubborn. The lighthouse was not just imprisoning them, it was turning them against each other. As the first bleak grey light of dawn began to seep through the grimy windows, the storm finally began to abate. The wind's shriek softened to a mournful sigh, and the punishing rain eased to a steady, depressing drizzle. Exhausted, they moved about the cottage like zombies, making coffee, forcing down dry toast, avoiding eye contact. The bravado of the previous day was gone, replaced by a grim, unspoken tension. It was Chloe who saw them. She had walked over to the archway leading to the tower, peering into the darkness. She was holding her coffee mug in both hands, as if for warmth, but Liam saw that the mug was trembling. "Guys," she said, her voice barely audible. You should come see this." They gathered around her. There, on the dusty stone floor just inside the cottage, were footprints, a short trail of them leading out from the tower's dark entrance. They were small and bare, perfectly formed impressions left in the dust, glistening with moisture. They looked like the footprints of a child, no older than 7 or 8, The trail consisted of 5 prints, each one distinct and clear, before it simply stopped. In the middle of the floor, there were no prints leading away, no scuff marks, no sign of what had made them or where it had gone. Ben stared at them, his mouth a hard line. "It is a leak," he said, his voice flat. He pointed a thick finger at the ceiling. Water dripped down from the roof, made puddles. That is all. "They are not puddles, Ben," Liam said, his voice low and steady. "They are footprints. Look at the toes, the heel." He was right. They were undeniably terrifying footprints. Each one was a perfect miniature map of a human foot, wet, bare, and childlike. Where did they go? Maya whispered, her eyes tracing the impossible path. "They just stop. It is a trick of the light, a coincidence," Ben insisted, his skepticism sounding more like a desperate prayer. "I am getting out of here for a bit. I need some air." He pulled on his boots and jacket and wrenched the cottage door open, striding out into the misty grey morning without a backward glance. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving the other 3 in the charged silence. The spell of denial was broken. The thing they were facing was not a product of their imaginations. It was real. It was inside with them. It had walked out of the tower while they were huddled in fear, leaving its mark on the floor as a quiet declaration of its presence. While Liam tried in vain to scrub the image of the footprints from his mind, Chloe retreated back to the keeper's logbook. It was her shield, her way of processing the terror through analysis and research. She sat at the table for hours, poring over Alistair Finch's mad scrawls, muttering to herself, cross-referencing his weather entries with historical maritime charts on her laptop, which thankfully still had some battery life. Liam found Maya in one of the small, cold bedrooms. She was sitting on the edge of a bed with a lumpy, stained mattress, her sketchbook open on her lap. She was not drawing. She was just staring at the page, at the dozens of spiral symbols she had unconsciously created. "I keep seeing it," she said without looking up at him. "When I close my eyes. The spiral. It is like it is pulling me in. Maya, maybe you should put that away for a while." "I cannot," she replied, her voice distant. "It feels like if I stop, something bad will happen, like I have to finish it." She picked up her charcoal stick, and her hand began to move again, her movements deft and sure. She was not drawing so much as tracing a shape that only she could see. She added more spirals, larger ones now, and connected them with sweeping, curved lines. An image was beginning to take shape in the chaos. Liam left her to it, his own sense of helplessness a physical weight in his chest. He felt responsible for them, for their safety, but he was utterly powerless. They were trapped on a rock in the middle of a churning sea, miles from civilization, in a place that was actively hostile to them. He found Chloe in the main room, her face pale with a new kind of excitement that was almost indistinguishable from fear. "Liam, I have found something. Something he did not want anyone to find." "What is it?" "I noticed the last few pages of the log were thicker than the others," she explained, her words coming in a rush. "And there were faint impressions on the final, blank page. Like he had been writing on the page before it so hard that it left a mark. So I did a pencil rubbing." She showed him a sheet of paper from her own notebook. She had laid it over the blank page in the logbook and gently rubbed the side of a pencil laid across it. The result was chilling, faint. Ghostly letters had emerged from the page. The desperate, indented words of Alistair Finch, written after his pen had run dry. This was his true final testament. The writing was even more unhinged than the inked entries. He no longer wrote about a weeping woman. That, Chloe explained, was probably the story he told himself at first, the legend he clung to in order to make sense of what was happening. But the truth was far worse. It is not a ghost, the ghostly letters read. A ghost is a memory. This place is a memory. The stone remembers. It does not grieve. It thirsts. It is a hungry echo. It sings the sorrow song to call them from the deep. They come when the sea is angry, the small ones first. They leave their wet tracks on the floor, but it wants more. The spire is a hook. The spiral is the bait. Liam felt the blood drain from his face, a hungry echo. It sings the sorrow song. The small ones first. The wet tracks on the floor. It was all there. A 40-year-old warning. The spiral, he breathed, his mind flashing to Maya, sketching furiously in the other room. He says it is bait, or a key, Chloe said, her voice trembling. A focus. He writes that it draws the eye inward, to the heart of the thirst. He says he tried to fight it. He tried to stay awake, to keep the light burning even in the day. But the hum always sang him to sleep, and in his sleep he dreamed of the spiral, and he drew it all over the walls. Liam grabbed the flashlight and ran to the tower archway. He shone the beam up the curved inner wall of the staircase. At first he saw nothing but damp, dark stone. But then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw them, faint, faded, but unmistakable, scratched into the very fabric of the lighthouse, almost invisible under decades of grime and moisture, were hundreds of spirals. Some were small, others huge, overlapping in a chaotic, mesmerizing pattern that covered the walls, a tapestry of madness ascending into the darkness. A scream from the main room tore him from his horrifying discovery. He sprinted back to find Chloe standing by the armchair where Maya had been working, her hands clamped over her mouth. Maya was gone. On the seat of the chair lay her sketchbook, open to the last page she had been drawing. Liam picked it up. His heart stopped. The chaotic collection of spirals and lines had resolved into a final, terrifying image. In the center of the page was a vortex of coiling lines, drawing the eye into a central point of darkness. And standing within that vortex, rendered in stark black charcoal, was a tall, unnaturally thin figure with no face, the figure he had seen on the rocks. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice cracking with panic. "I do not know," Chloe cried. "I was reading, and I looked up and she was just gone." They searched the small cottage frantically. The two small bedrooms, the tiny bathroom with its rust-stained toilet. She was not there. Ben was still outside. The front door was still closed. There was only one other place she could be. With a dawning, sickening horror, Liam looked toward the dark archway leading into the lighthouse tower. "Maya," he whispered. Just as he took a step toward the tower, the cottage door flew open, and Ben stumbled in, his face pale and his clothes soaked through. "The car," he gasped, leaning against the doorframe. "It will not start. The engine is completely dead, and the tires, all 4 of them are flat, slashed to ribbons." The news hit them like a physical blow. Their only means of escape was gone. They were stranded, truly and completely trapped. As this realization settled over them, a new sound began. The low, resonant hum from within the tower walls began to intensify, rising in pitch and volume until the very air in the cottage seemed to vibrate with it. It was a deep, guttural, predatory thrum that they could feel in their teeth, in their bones. And then, just as the last of the miserable daylight outside finally died, the single bare bulb in the ceiling flickered twice and went out. They were plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. The only light was the faint, dying red pulse of the embers in the fireplace. The vibrating hum from the tower abruptly stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was more terrifying than any sound they had yet heard. It was a heavy, listening silence, and in that silence, they all heard it. It came from just outside the front door, a sound that was quiet, yet clear as a bell in the dead stillness, a soft, wet, scraping noise, a deliberate, rhythmic scratching, like something sharp and hard, being dragged slowly and patiently down the thick oak of the door. It was the sound of a patient predator testing the limits of its cage. Scratch. A long pause. Scratch. No one breathed. Liam's blood ran cold. It was not the sound of a tree branch. It was not an animal. It was methodical. It was intelligent. It was the sound of something wanting to get in. Ben, his face a grim silhouette against the dying embers, straightened up. The terror had pushed him past his breaking point, and some part of him had snapped, replaced by a reckless, angry defiance. "No," he growled, his voice a low rumble. "No more. I am not hiding from the damn wind." He snatched his heavy flashlight from the floor, the beam cutting a violent slash through the darkness. He started toward the door. "Ben, stop!" Chloe shrieked, her voice thin with panic. "Do not open it. Get back from the door," Liam yelled, his own voice tight with terror. Ben ignored them. He was a man possessed, driven by a desperate need to find a rational explanation, to prove to himself and to them that there were no monsters, only fear. He reached the door in 3 long strides. The scratching continued, steady and unhurried. He raised his free hand, his fingers outstretched. The scratching stopped. The instant his fingertips touched the cold iron of the doorknob, the world outside went utterly, profoundly silent. The world held its breath in the space between heartbeats. Ben's hand was a knot of white knuckles on the black iron doorknob. The silence from outside was absolute, a perfect, predatory void. It was more terrifying than the scratching had been. The scratching was a question. The silence was an answer. "Ben, get away from there," Liam hissed, his voice a dry rasp. He took a step forward, his own flashlight beam trembling, painting a frantic, dancing circle on the floor. "Do not," Ben said, his voice a low growl of defiance. He was not looking at Liam or Chloe. His eyes were fixed on the solid oak of the door, as if he were in a standoff with the wood itself. "I am done being scared of noises." He twisted the knob. The latch gave a loud, metallic click that echoed in the tomb-like quiet. He pulled. The heavy door swung inward with a low groan, opening onto a wall of impenetrable misty blackness. Nothing. There was nothing there. No monster, no beast, no scratching thing from the sea. Just the cold, damp night air, thick with the smell of brine and wet earth. The muted, distant roar of the waves was the only sound. Ben let out a shaky, triumphant breath. He swept his flashlight beam across the empty stone stoop and the muddy ground beyond. "See," he said, his voice cracking with relief and a touch of "I told you so" arrogance. "Nothing." It was a raccoon, a damn badger. It heard me coming and ran off. Liam felt a wave of dizzying relief wash over him, so potent it almost buckled his knees. His fear, coiled and tight in his gut, began to unspool. Ben was right. Of course, he was right. An animal, a branch, anything but the alternative. Chloe, who had been hiding her face in her hands, looked up, her expression fragile with hope. "An animal." "Of course, an animal," Ben said, his confidence returning with every passing second of normalcy. He started to push the door closed. "Now, let's find a lamp and figure out where the hell Maya went." But as the door began to swing shut, Liam's flashlight beam, which had been aimed at the floor, caught something on the threshold. "Wait," he said, his voice sharp. "Ben, hold it." He stepped forward, crouching down by the open door. The relief that had flooded him moments before receded instantly, replaced by a returning tide of ice-cold dread. There, on the surface of the thick granite flagstone that formed the doorstep, were the marks. They were not the scuff marks of an animal's claws. They were 3 long, deep gouges scraped into the solid rock, as if something of immense weight and sharpness had been dragged across it. They were fresh. Grains of pulverized stone lay in fine dust along the edges of the grooves, and glistening inside the scratches was a dark, viscous fluid, thick like oil, and reeking of low tide and spoiled meat. "Oh my God," Chloe whispered, coming to look over his shoulder. Ben fell silent. He stared down at the marks, his flashlight beam joining Liam's. The smug confidence drained from his face, leaving behind a pallid mask of disbelief and dawning horror. His simple, rational explanation had been shredded, literally carved out of the stone at his feet. Liam reached out a trembling finger, stopping just short of touching the foul liquid. His light moved from the scratches to a small object lying just beside the stoop. It was a single, dark strand of something that looked like seaweed, but it was not the familiar green or brown of the coast. It was a deep, oily black, with a texture that seemed more fibrous and coarse, almost like hair. Without thinking, Chloe bent down and picked it up. She immediately recoiled, dropping it with a small cry. "It is freezing," she gasped, rubbing her fingers together as if trying to wipe away a stain. "And it feels wrong. It is tough, like leather." The three of them stood there in the doorway, their flashlights trained on the damning evidence. The gouged stone, the foul slime, the unnatural black strand. The thing had been there. 2 inches of oak had separated them from it. Its silence had not been retreat, it had been patience. The renewed terror was a catalyst. It shocked them out of their paralysis and brought the other, more immediate crisis crashing back down on them. Maya. She is in the tower, Liam said, his voice flat and dead with certainty. She has to be. He slammed the door shut and threw the heavy bolt across, a futile gesture against whatever had been outside, but a necessary act for their own sanity. He turned, his flashlight beam cutting a path to the dark archway. The thought of climbing that staircase again, of willingly entering the humming, weeping core of that place, was physically nauseating, but the thought of leaving Maya in there alone was infinitely worse. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. He had planned this trip. He had brought them here. He was responsible. "We have to go get her," he said. Ben, for the first time, did not argue. He did not offer a skeptical alternative. He just nodded, his face grim, his jaw set. The evidence at the door had shattered his disbelief. He was finally, truly scared. They armed themselves. 2 powerful flashlights and a heavy iron fire poker that Liam wrenched from the hearth. It was a pathetic arsenal against the unknown, but holding the weight of it in his hand gave him a sliver of courage. Chloe was shaking her head, her eyes wide with terror. "We cannot." The logbook. Alistair wrote that the tower is the heart of the thirst. It is what wants us. Going in there is what it wants us to do. "She is our friend, Chloe," Liam said, his voice harder than he intended. "We are not leaving her in there." Her expression crumbled, and she nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She would not be left alone. The 3 of them would face it together. Stepping through the archway for the second time was 1,000 times worse than the first. The cold was more profound, a living entity that seemed to actively suck the warmth from their bodies. The humming was back, a low, predatory thrum that vibrated up through the soles of their boots. And with it, the weeping. It was no longer a faint sound at the edge of hearing. It was a clear, layered chorus of sorrow, seeming to echo from all around them, a symphony of despair that resonated with the humming stone. They began to climb, a tight, terrified procession of 3. Ben took the lead, his broad shoulders a temporary shield. Liam followed, wielding the fire poker, and Chloe brought up the rear, her hand clutching the back of Liam's jacket. Their flashlight beams sliced and danced in the oppressive dark, illuminating the damp, curving walls. The faded spirals scratched into the stone seemed to writhe in the moving light, an ancient, malevolent graffiti. The tower was not a passive structure, it was an active participant in their terror. As they climbed higher, it began to fight back, toying with them, trying to break them. "Help me, please." The voice was Maya's, thin and terrified, and it came from far above them, echoing down the stairwell. "Maya," Liam shouted, his voice cracking. "We are coming. Hold on." They scrambled faster up the iron steps, their boots clanging in a frantic rhythm. "Liam, is that you?" This time her voice was right behind him, a desperate whisper in his ear. He spun around so fast he nearly lost his footing, swinging the flashlight beam into Chloe's terrified face. There was no one else there. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his heart hammering. "I heard it," Chloe sobbed. "It was right behind us." The lighthouse was playing with them, throwing Maya's voice around like a ventriloquist, using their hope as a weapon. Ben suddenly stopped, grabbing the iron handrail for support. He was breathing heavily, his face slick with sweat. "The stairs," he gasped. "They are moving. They feel like they are tilting." Liam shone his light on the steps. They were solid, unmoving iron. "They are not moving, Ben. You are okay." "No, they are," he insisted, his voice rising in panic. "It is like the whole tower is swaying. I am going to fall." His famous skepticism, his anchor in a world of logic, had been severed. He was adrift in a sea of the impossible, and he was drowning. Liam pushed past him, taking the lead. He had to stay in control. He had to get them to the top, but the tower had something for him too. In the darkness at the top of the next flight of stairs, he saw it, the tall black silhouette standing perfectly still, waiting for him. He cried out, raising the fire poker, his flashlight beam finding the spot. It was gone. There was only the empty curve of the wall, but he had seen it. He knew he had. They pushed onward, terror now their only fuel. The humming grew louder, the weeping turning into a full-throated, agonizing scream that seemed to bore directly into their skulls. Finally, gasping for breath, their bodies shaking with exhaustion and fear, they stumbled into the lantern room. It was empty, cold, dark and empty. The great glass lens was a silent, monolithic presence in the center of the room. The iron door to the walkway was bolted shut from the inside, just as they had left it. Their flashlight beams crisscrossed the room in a frantic, desperate search. "She is not here," Ben yelled over the screaming sound, which seemed to be emanating from the very air around them. "Where could she be?" "The door is locked," Chloe cried. "There is no other way out." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Liam's adrenaline-fueled resolve. They had been so sure. She had to be here. He swept his light across the room one more time, his beam falling on the floor near the base of the lens apparatus. His blood froze. Lying on the grimy iron floor was a single stick of black charcoal, Maya's charcoal, and around it, etched into the thick dust and grime, was a massive, perfectly rendered spiral. It dominated the center of the room, its lines clean and deliberate. It was the same symbol from the logbook, the same symbol Maya had been obsessively drawing. It had not been there when he and Ben were up here before. Maya had been here. She had completed her drawing. As they all stared at the horrifying symbol on the floor, a new sound began. A low, grinding groan of metal on metal, of ancient, rust-choked machinery being forced into movement. It came from the lens mechanism. Slowly, impossibly, the huge assembly of prisms began to turn. The humming intensified, the vibration in the floor so powerful it was hard to stand. And then, from the lamp at the heart of the lens, a light began to glow. It was not the brilliant white light of a lighthouse beacon. It was a vile, sickly, green-black light, like the phosphorescence of deep-sea decay. It pulsed, a slow, rhythmic beat, like a monstrous heart. The unholy light, did not illuminate the room. It seemed to swallow the beams from their flashlights, plunging the space into a murky, submarine gloom. Their powerful beams were reduced to pathetic, watery cones that barely pierced the darkness. The weeping sound that had tormented them during their climb now converged, focusing itself inside the lens. It became a single, piercing scream of pure agony that erupted from the pulsating dark light. The sound was so intense, so full of pain, that they all clamped their hands over their ears. But it did no good. The scream was inside their heads. Trapped in the roaring, screaming darkness, bathed in the nauseating glow of the black light, Liam looked down at the spiral on the floor. In the pulsing, otherworldly light, it was no longer a static drawing. The lines seemed to move, to writhe like living snakes, the spiral appearing to rotate slowly, drawing their vision, their very thoughts, down into its dark, waiting center. The lighthouse was awake, and they were in its heart. The black light pulsed. The scream was a physical thing, a blade of sound that flayed their nerves and vibrated in their bones. Liam was on his knees, hands clamped over his ears in a useless attempt to block out the noise that was already inside him. Across the room, Ben was curled in a fetal position, his body shuddering. Chloe stood frozen, her face a white mask of catatonic horror, her eyes fixed on the monstrous glowing lens. The spiral on the floor writhed. It was an optical illusion, Liam told himself. A trick of the pulsating, nauseating light. But the logical part of his brain was a small, screaming voice in a hurricane of pure terror. The spiral was a vortex, a drain, and he could feel it pulling at his sanity, trying to suck him down into its coiling, black heart. Then the light changed. It bled outward, away from the lens, spreading across the thick, grimy glass panes that encircled the room. The scream softened, receding into the background to become a constant, high-pitched keen of agony. The murky green-black light began to coalesce on the glass, the swirling motes of darkness forming shapes, forming images. The lantern room had become a horrific 360-degree cinema, and they were the captive audience. A silent film of past tragedies began to play on the glass walls. A little boy with his father's eyes laughed as he chased a crab across wet black rocks. A rogue wave, impossibly large and dark, reared up like a striking snake. The image was slow, languid, a beautiful and terrible ballet. The wave crashed down. The boy was gone. The scene shifted. A woman, her face hollowed out by grief, stood on the narrow iron walkway outside the lantern room. The wind tore at her dress and hair. Her mouth was open in a silent, unending scream of loss. She climbed onto the railing. For a moment, she seemed to hang in the air, a broken angel against a bruised sky. Then she fell. Another shift. A new man, Alistair Finch. He was gaunt, his eyes burning with a feverish light, a mixture of terror and divine ecstasy. He held a sharp rock in his hand, and by the light of a single lantern, he carved a spiral into the stone wall of the tower staircase. His lips were moving, but the only sound was the high, keening wail from the lens. He was praying to it, worshipping it. The historical horrors were a prelude, an appetizer for the main course. The lighthouse was showing them its resume, the depths of its power, before it turned its attention to them. The light pulsed, and the visions became personal. The entity reached into their minds, into their memories, and pulled their deepest regrets out into the open, projecting them in shimmering, accusing light. On the glass in front of Ben, an image of a sterile, beige hospital room appeared. An old man lay under a thin white sheet, his breath a shallow, rattling struggle. A heart monitor beside the bed drew a faltering, weak line. Ben made a choked, strangled sound. It was his father. Ben had been in Mexico on vacation when he died, ignoring the calls from the hospital. "He is fine," he had told his sister. "He is always fine." The figure on the bed turned its head. Its eyes were milky white, empty. Yet they found Ben across the lantern room, across the years. A voice, dry as dust, whispered from the lens. A voice that was not his father's, but wore its memory like a mask. "You were not there, Benny. You left me alone." Ben scrambled backward, crab walking away from the vision, his face a mess of tears and sweat. "No," he sobbed. "No, I am sorry. I am so sorry." The light shifted to Chloe. She saw the hallowed halls of her university, but the scene was twisted and nightmarish. Her doctoral advisor, a man she revered, stood before a packed lecture hall, holding up her dissertation. He was laughing. "Derivative," he boomed, his voice echoing with disdain. "Unoriginal. A complete fraud." The audience, filled with the faces of her colleagues and rivals, joined in the laughter. The pages of her thesis, her life's work, burst into flames in her advisor's hands. Her deepest fear, not monsters or ghosts, but failure, humiliation. The quiet, academic dread of being found wanting. Then it was Liam's turn. The light swirled and he was back in the warm, cheerful pub where this whole nightmare had been born. He saw himself, smiling, enthusiastic, laying out the map on the table. He saw Ben, Chloe, and Maya, all laughing, excited. "It will be an adventure," he heard his own voice say, echoing with dreadful irony. As he watched, the faces of his friends began to decay. Their skin grew taut, their eyes sank back into their skulls, their smiling lips peeled back to reveal grinning teeth. They were skeletons in their old clothes, and they were all pointing at him, accusing him. Their spectral voices joined the keening from the lens, a chorus of blame. "You brought us here. You led us to this place." The vision twisted again. He was standing on the edge of a vast black sea under a starless sky. The water was unnaturally calm, like polished obsidian. Just beneath the surface, a pale face floated, its eyes closed, its long dark hair fanning out like a halo. It was Maya. Her eyes snapped open. They were solid black. She raised a hand, her fingers pressing against the underside of the water's surface, as if it were a pane of glass. Her voice was not a sound, but a thought, pushed directly into his mind. "You left me, Liam. You climbed the tower, but you did not find me. You left me in the dark." The psychological assault was total. a precise and brutal vivisection of their souls. The lighthouse was feeding on them, gorging itself on their pain, their guilt, their fear. It wanted to break them, to drown them in their own sorrow, until they gave up, until they became just another layer of grief, soaked into its thirsty stones. But for Ben, the grief was transfigured into rage. The vision of his dying father had broken something deep inside him. With a raw, guttural roar that was more animal than human, he lurched to his feet. He was no longer afraid. He was beyond fear. He snatched up the iron fire poker from where Liam had dropped it. Then Liam screamed, but his voice was lost in the din. Ben charged the central lens. He was a bull, a berserker, his face contorted in a mask of pure suicidal fury. "Leave us alone," he bellowed, and he swung the heavy iron poker with all his strength, aiming for the pulsing black heart of the light. The poker connected with the iron housing of the lens with a deafening, discordant clang, a sound of tortured metal that sent sparks flying into the murky air. For a single, heart-stopping moment, the black light flickered, the screaming from within it faltered. Then the light pulsed with renewed intensity, a wave of pure force erupting from the lens. It struck Ben in the chest and flung him through the air as if he were a rag doll. He crashed into the far wall of the lantern room and crumpled to the floor, motionless. The screaming returned, louder and more triumphant than before. The visions swirled, intensifying. Liam stared at Ben's still form, at the useless poker that lay beside him. They could not fight it. They could not reason with it. There was only one option. "Chloe, we have to go." "No," he yelled, grabbing her arm. She was still staring at the mocking faces of her colleagues, her body rigid. He shook her hard. "Chloe." Her eyes focused on him, the spell broken. The terror returned, sharp and immediate. She nodded, and together they scrambled for the doorway to the stairs, dragging themselves away from the light, away from the poison of their own memories. They half-carried, half-dragged Ben's groaning, semi-conscious form with them. The descent was a new kind of hell. The tower was no longer content to just scare them. It was actively trying to kill them. The iron steps were coated in a thick, slick layer of the same black, briny fluid they had found on the doorstep. It was like trying to run down a slide covered in oil. Their feet slipped and slid, and they had to cling to the central pillar and the outer wall to keep from falling headfirst into the darkness below. The whole tower was shaking now, a violent rhythmic tremor that coincided with the pulsing of the black light far above them. It felt as though the ancient stone was about to tear itself apart. And they were not alone on the stairs. Cold, intangible hands grabbed at their ankles from the spaces between the steps. A frigid breath, smelling of the deep, lightless ocean, whispered against the backs of their necks. They could hear skittering, scratching sounds from the darkness both above and below them, the sound of things with too many legs crawling in the walls. They fell and stumbled their way down, their bodies bruised and battered, their minds screaming. Finally they saw it, the pale rectangle of the archway leading back into the cottage. With a final, desperate burst of adrenaline, they tumbled through the opening, falling in a heap onto the dusty stone floor. Liam slammed the heavy wooden door to the tower shut and threw the bolt, The horrifying sounds from the staircase were instantly muffled, though the deep, resonant humming from the stones continued, a constant reminder that the door was not a barrier, merely a temporary inconvenience. They lay on the floor, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. They were alive, they were out. But the cottage was no longer a sanctuary. The entity's presence had bled through the walls, corrupting their last safe space. A foul, rotten smell filled the room. Liam pushed himself up and looked at the kitchen counter where they had left their supplies. The loaf of bread was covered in a thick, velvety black mold that seemed to crawl and shift before his eyes. The apples in a bowl were collapsed and putrid, swimming in a brown, bubbling liquid. All of it, everything they had to eat, was utterly, unnaturally spoiled. He turned the knob on the sink. The faucet sputtered, and then a thick, black, oily sludge oozed out, the same viscous fluid that had been on the doorstep, on the stairs. The corruption was absolute. The lighthouse was starving them, cutting them off from all sustenance. It was isolating them not just from the world, but from life itself. Liam's eyes fell upon Maya's sketchbook, still lying on the table. He walked over to it, his legs unsteady. He opened it. The first few pages were her beautiful, if unsettling, landscapes. Then came the spirals, then the single, terrifying drawing of the tall, black figure. He flipped the page. The figure was there again, drawn with more pressure. He flipped again and again. Every single remaining page was filled with the same image, drawn over and over. The lines grew harder, more frantic, the charcoal gouging the paper. The figure was drawn standing, then looming, then bending over, as if looking down at the artist herself. On the last few pages, the image was unrecognizable, just a furious, black, violent scribble, a hole of pure rage and terror torn through the paper. They were broken, they were defeated, trapped in a contaminated cell, with no food, no water, no escape, and no hope. Ben was stirring, groaning on the floor, a large bruise already forming on his temple. Chloe was sitting at the table, rocking back and forth, her eyes vacant. This is how it ends, Liam thought. We will go mad, just like Alistair Finch. We will starve, or we will just open the door and let the sea have us. Chloe stopped rocking, her eyes focused on the keeper's logbook, still open on the table. With a sudden, renewed purpose, she pulled it toward her. She ignored the frantic, inked entries and the pencil-rubbed warnings. She began to tear at the book itself, her fingers scrabbling at the thick, leather-bound spine. "Chloe, what are you doing?" Liam asked, his voice dull. "There is something else," she muttered, her voice a raw whisper. "There has to be." She tore the brittle pages away from the spine, revealing the stitched binding underneath. Tucked deep into the seam, almost invisible, was a tiny, tightly folded piece of brittle, yellowed paper. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it. It was covered in Alistair Finch's spidery, barely legible script. It must have been his very last act, a final secret he had hidden from the thing that was consuming him. Chloe held it close to the dying light of the fire's embers and read it aloud, her voice shaking but clear. "It cannot take what is not given. Sorrow is the key. It drinks the tears, it eats the grief. Do not weep for the lost. Do not feed the stone. Starve it. Starve it. The words hung in the air, a tiny flickering ember of hope in the suffocating darkness. Sorrow is the key. As if summoned by the reading of the words, a new sound began. It was not the humming of the tower or the shriek from the lens. It was quiet, close, and heartbreakingly familiar. From behind the closed door of one of the small, dark bedrooms came the sound of soft, gentle weeping. It was Maya's voice. They all froze, their heads turning toward the door. The weeping was unmistakable. It was her, the hiccuping, breathless sobs of someone who had been crying for a very, very long time. It could not be. Was it another trick? Another auditory hallucination designed to torment them? To make them produce the very sorrow the lighthouse craved? Or was it really her? Trapped in that room, terrified, waiting for them to save her. The weeping grew louder, more desperate, punctuated by a single, pleading word. Liam. His name. She was calling for him. Alistair's warning echoed in his mind. Do not weep for the lost. Starve the stone. But the sound of his friend, crying his name from the darkness, was a pull stronger than any logic, more potent than any fear. He looked at the bedroom door. He looked at Chloe's terrified, pleading eyes, silently begging him not to go. He heard Ben groan his name from the floor. He heard Maya sob it again from behind the door. He was trapped between a dead man's warning and a living friend's plea. His heart torn in two, Liam took a single, unsteady step toward the bedroom door. Do not, Liam. Chloe's voice was a ragged thread of sound, barely audible over the hammering in his own ears. Please, it is a trick, Liam. The voice from behind the door was weaker now, a fragile, trembling whisper. It was the sound of hope beginning to die. Please. It is so cold in here. He took another step. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight. The fire poker felt impossibly heavy in his hand. His knuckles were white where he gripped the flashlight. Ben was on his hands and knees, shaking his head as if to clear it. The bruise on his temple was a dark, ugly plum color. Maya, he slurred, his words thick. Is that? Ben, stay down, Liam ordered, his eyes locked on the simple, terrifying rectangle of the bedroom door. Starve the stone. Alistair Finch's words were a frantic whisper in the back of his mind. Sorrow is the key. He knew with a sick, cold certainty that Chloe was right. This was a lure. The entity was a predator, and it was baiting its trap with the perfect piece of meat, their love for their friend. But knowing it was a trap and ignoring it were two different things. What if they were wrong? What if, by some miracle, she was alive, trapped, and he did nothing? The guilt of that possibility was a weight he knew he could not bear. He would rather walk into the monster's jaws than live with the ghost of that choice. I have to, he said, the words aimed at Chloe, at himself, at the memory of a dead lighthouse keeper. I am sorry. He reached the door. The weeping from inside had stopped. The silence that replaced it was heavy, expectant. He could feel the house listening. He could feel the cold, ancient intelligence that saturated the stones, focusing all of its attention on him, on the doorknob, on the decision about to be made. He placed his hand on the cold, brass knob. It was frigid, as if it were coated in a thin layer of frost. He turned it. The latch clicked. He pushed the door inward. A wave of cold rolled out of the room, a palpable entity that smelled of stagnant seawater and something else, something metallic and wrong, like old pennies and blood. The darkness inside was absolute, a solid thing that seemed to drink the light from the dying fire. Liam raised his flashlight, its beam cutting a clean white cone into the oppressive black. The room was almost bare. A rusted iron bed frame stood against the far wall, stripped of any mattress. Dust lay in thick, undisturbed blankets on the floor, and in the center of the room, standing with her back to them, was a figure. It was Maya. Her slight frame was unmistakable. Her dark hair, plastered to her head and back, dripped rhythmically onto the floorboards. Drip, drip, drip. She was wearing the same clothes she had on when she disappeared, but they were soaked through, clinging to her skin. It looked as though she had just been pulled from the sea. Maya. Liam's voice was a choked, trembling thing. The figure did not move. It did not speak. The only sound was the steady, unnerving dripping of dark water onto the dusty floor. Ben, seeing her, was galvanized. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying, his hand pressed to his injured head. "Maya," he cried, a surge of desperate relief in his voice. "Oh, thank God. We are here. We will get you out of this hellhole." He stumbled forward, moving past Liam into the room, his arms outstretched. "Ben, wait," Liam shouted, a primal instinct screaming at him that something was terribly wrong. As Ben drew closer, the figure of Maya finally moved. It was not the fluid, graceful movement of the friend they knew. It was a slow, horrifyingly stiff motion, a series of jerks, as if her limbs were being pulled by unseen strings. Her head turned first, a slow, ratcheting swivel that was audible in the silence, then her shoulders, then her torso. She turned to face them. They saw her face. It was Maya's, the shape of her jaw, her nose, the curve of her lips. It was all hers. However, it was a grotesque parody. Her skin was a luminous, fish-belly white, stretched taut over her bones. Her lips were blue. Her eyes, however, were gone. In their place were two solid, shining orbs of black, like polished jet, like holes punched through to a dimension of infinite night. They reflected the flashlight beam without a glint of recognition or life. From the corner of her perfect blue lips, a thin trickle of the same black, oily water that had been on the stairs ran down her chin. Ben stopped dead, his arms falling to his sides. The relief on his face curdled into a mask of utter soul-shattering horror. "You were so sad," the thing wearing Maya's body said. The voice was an abomination. It was a chorus of whispers and moans, the high, keening grief of the keeper's wife, the low, mad ramblings of Alistair Finch, the gurgling cry of a drowning child, all layered over over one another to form a single dissonant sound that scraped at their sanity. It was the voice of the lighthouse, all of you. The chorus voice continued, a sound like grinding stones and breaking glass. So much beautiful sadness. I could feel it from the moment you arrived. I kept it, a gift. The confirmation was a physical blow. Maya was gone. She was dead. This thing, this ancient, hungry echo, had taken her, and now it was wearing her corpse like a suit. The desperate, foolish hope Liam had clung to was extinguished, and in its place, a tidal wave of pure, undiluted grief and horror crashed down upon him. He felt his knees buckle. Beside him, he heard Chloe let out a thin, broken sob. And that was what the entity had been waiting for. Their combined wave of despair was a feast. The humming in the stones roared back to life, a triumphant, deafening crescendo. The thing wearing Maya's face smiled, a ghastly, tight-lipped expression that did not reach her black, empty eyes. "Thank you," it whispered. Then it lunged. It moved with a speed that was impossible, a blur of motion that defied physics. It did not go for Liam, the one with the weapon. It did not go for Chloe, the one who was cowering by the door. It launched itself at Ben, the one who was closest, the one whose soul it had just shattered. Its hands, which had been Maya's delicate, artistic hands, elongated, the fingers stretched, the nails darkening and thickening, growing in an instant into long, black, needle-sharp talons. They tore through Ben's thick jacket and the flannel shirt beneath as if they were tissue paper. Ben's scream was a raw, terrible sound of agony and disbelief. It was a sound that would haunt Liam for the rest of his very short life. The scream broke Liam's paralysis. The grief and horror were still there, a howling void inside him, but they were eclipsed by a white-hot primal rage. He raised the fire poker and charged, roaring, a sound of pure animal fury. He brought the heavy iron rod down on the creature's back. It connected with a sickening wet thud, a sound like hitting a side of beef. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched, electronic squeal that was nothing like its chorus voice, and spun around, backhanding Liam across the face. The blow was like being hit by a car. Liam flew backward, his head cracking against the stone doorframe of the cottage. The world exploded into a starburst of white, and the flashlight flew from his grasp, skittering into a dark corner. The creature stood up, leaving Ben bleeding and moaning on the floor. It turned its attention to Liam, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, the black eyes fixed on him. It took a step, its movements now fluid and predatory. From the edge of his swimming vision, Liam saw a flash of movement, Chloe. Her face was a mess of tears, but her expression was one of fierce, terrified determination. She had grabbed a heavy, empty wine bottle from the floor by the hearth. With a desperate scream, she ran at the creature and brought the bottle down on the back of its head. The bottle shattered, but the creature barely flinched. It turned its head a full 180 degrees to look at her, its neck twisting with a series of audible cracks. It smiled its dead-lipped smile. Chloe stumbled backward, her hand over her mouth, her momentary courage evaporating into pure terror. The thing ignored her. It seemed to consider her no threat. Its focus was on Liam. It advanced on him as he struggled to get up, his head pounding, the room tilting violently. "The planner," the chorus voice hissed, the sound seeming to come from all around him now. "The anchor. You feel the weight of all this, do not you? Their pain is your pain, their deaths are your fault." It was inside his head, its voice a venomous whisper weaving through his thoughts. It was taunting him, trying to break him down, to make him give in to the despair it craved. It was 2 feet away. He could smell it now, the overpowering stench of the cold, dark bottom of the sea. He was weaponless. Ben was down. Chloe was paralyzed with fear. This was it. Then something changed. Chloe, backed against the far wall, began to make a strange sound. At first, Liam thought she was choking. Then he realized she was laughing. It was not a sound of happiness or humor. It was a terrible, broken sound, high and hysterical, bubbling up from a place beyond fear, beyond sanity. Tears streamed down her face, but she laughed, a wild, shrieking, unhinged peal of utter, defiant madness. "You want sorrow?" she shrieked, her voice cracking, the laughter catching in her throat like sobs. "You want our grief? Is that all you are? Just a cosmic leech?" She laughed harder, a raw, grating sound that filled the cottage. "There is nothing left to take. It is just funny now. This is all so stupidly, horribly funny." The effect was instantaneous and profound. The creature flinched back as if she had thrown acid on it. It raised its clawed hands to its head, to where its ears should be, and it let out a shriek of its own. It was that same high-pitched electronic squeal, but this time it was a sound of agony, of confusion. The humming in the walls of the lighthouse faltered. The oppressive, heavy atmosphere in the cottage thinned, just for a second, like a lifting pressure. It fed on sorrow. Liam's mind, suddenly clear, seized on the thought. It fed on grief and fear and regret, but this raw, defiant, insane blast of hysterical joy, it was poison. It was indigestible. It was a frequency the entity could not compute. Chloe's laughter gave him the opening he needed. While the creature was reeling, clutching its head, Liam scrambled across the floor, his hands searching frantically for the fire poker. His fingers brushed against the cool, solid iron. He looked up. Ben was moving. He was grievously wounded, his shirt soaked in blood, but he was crawling. He was not crawling away. He was crawling toward a tall, heavy wooden bookcase that stood against the wall next to the bedroom. It was filled with the old keeper's manuals and charts. With a guttural groan of effort that was half pain and half rage, Ben put his shoulder to the base of the bookcase and pushed. The creature was recovering. Its shriek subsided, and it lowered its hands, its black eyes fixing on Chloe with a look of pure, murderous hatred. It started toward her. "Hey!" Liam yelled, getting to his feet, the poker held tight in a two-handed grip. "It is me you want." The creature turned. Its stolen face was twisted into a snarl of inhuman rage. It forgot Chloe. It forgot the wounded man on the floor. It saw Liam, the one who had defied it, had led the others, and it launched itself at him. At that exact moment, the heavy bookcase, pushed by the last of Ben's strength, began to topple. It moved in slow motion, a great dark rectangle of wood and paper, its shadow falling over the creature as it hurtled toward Liam. The creature sensed the movement an instant too late. It tried to leap back, but its feet got tangled in the threadbare rug. To see. It looked up just as the top corner of the bookcase caught it squarely on the shoulder, driving it to the floor with a final splintering crash of wood and a piercing, inhuman shriek. The crash echoed in the sudden, ringing silence. Wood splintered, books tumbled. A cloud of ancient dust billowed into the air, thick and choking. For a moment, the only sound was the ragged, desperate gasping of 3 human beings. Then the shrieking started. It was a sound of pure, electronic rage, a high-frequency scream of metal shearing and circuits overloading. It came from beneath the shattered bookcase, a sound so unnatural and piercing it felt like it was drilling directly into their brains. A single black-taloned hand, impossibly long and thin, twitched and clawed at the air from under the wreckage, scrabbling for purchase on the dusty floorboards. Liam stood frozen, the fire poker clutched in his hands, his knuckles bloodless. His body was a symphony of pain. His head throbbed where it had hit the stone, and his face was already swelling from the creature's blow. He was watching that hand, watching the frenzied, impotent rage of the trapped thing. Chloe's hysterical laughter had died, replaced by a shuddering, broken sob of pure shock. Her gaze darted from the pinned creature to Ben. Ben! Her cry broke the spell. Liam's focus snapped from the monster to his friend. Ben was lying in a heap near the bedroom doorway, a dark, glistening pool already spreading out from under him on the pale wood floor. His eyes were half closed, his breathing shallow and wet. "We have to help him," Liam said, his voice a raw croak. The next hour was a blur of frantic, clumsy desperation. While Liam stood guard, the poker held like a spear, his eyes never leaving the twitching black hand, Chloe became a battlefield medic. She tore strips from the cleanest-looking bedsheet she could find in the corrupted bedroom, her hands shaking so badly she could barely rip the fabric. The gashes in Ben's chest and arm were deep, terrifying things, the flesh laid open to the bone. "We have to clean it," she stammered, her mind racing. "Infection." Liam's eyes scanned the room. The water was poison, but Ben had brought a flask of expensive single malt scotch, a celebratory drink for their first night. It was lying on the floor near his duffel bag. "The whiskey," Liam said. "Use the whiskey." Ben screamed when the alcohol touched his open wounds, a raw, ragged sound that was worse than the creature's shrieking. He thrashed, and Liam had to help Chloe hold him down, murmuring useless reassurances as she grimly poured the liquor over the torn flesh, washing away the blood and whatever foulness had been on the creature's claws. They packed the wounds with the strips of sheet and bound them tight, creating crude, desperate pressure bandages. It was a pathetic, insufficient effort, but it was all they had. Ben's skin was cold and clammy, his face the color of wet ash. He was fading, muttering nonsensical words, his consciousness slipping away. All the while, The thing under the bookcase shrieked and thrashed, the entire weight of the heavy wood shuddering with its efforts. But the angle was awkward, and the solid oak held, for now. After what felt like an eternity, the piercing shriek subsided, replaced by a low, guttural hissing, like a cornered snake. The thrashing lessened. The black hand stopped its frantic clawing and lay still on the floor, fingers slightly curled. The immediate crisis was over. A fragile, temporary stalemate had been reached. The cottage was a fortress under siege, with the enemy trapped in the throne room. Liam's adrenaline began to ebb, and the pain from his injuries came crashing in. His head felt like it was splitting open. He leaned heavily on the poker, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. Chloe sat back on her heels, her face and hands smeared with Ben's blood. She looked at his pale, still face, then at the wreckage of the bookcase, and then at Liam. The full, crushing weight of their situation descended upon them. "What do we do now?" she whispered, her voice hollow with exhaustion and despair. Liam looked around the ruined cottage, the corrupted food, the poisoned water, their dying friend, their only escape route destroyed. Their enemy, a thing from the dawn of time, was temporarily inconvenienced a few feet away. Hope was a laughable fantasy. "It is the lighthouse," he said, the thoughts forming slowly in his concussed brain. "It is not just her." He could not bring himself to say Maya's name. That thing is just a puppet. The tower, the lens, that is the heart. We saw it. We felt it. Chloe nodded, her gaze distant. She was replaying the horrifying visions from the lantern room, the way the light had pulsed with malevolent life. "Alistair's note," she murmured. "Starve the stone. He meant we should not feed it our sorrow. My laughing, it hurt it." "But we cannot laugh forever," Liam said grimly. "We cannot just stop being scared. It is a temporary defense, not a weapon. And Ben," he looked at his friend's still form, "he needs a doctor, he needs a hospital. We cannot just wait for this thing to starve." Desperation was a catalyst. It forced their exhausted minds to work, to search for an option beyond waiting for death. Chloe's eyes fell upon the pile of books that had spilled from the shattered bookcase. Most were ruined, but a few of the thick leather-bound technical manuals were intact. She crawled over and pulled one free. She flipped through the brittle pages, her eyes scanning the detailed sepia-toned diagrams. "Here," she said, her voice rising with a flicker of excitement. The lamp. It was originally a hyper-radiant Fresnel lens with a multi-wick Argand burner. It ran on a specific type of pressurized paraffin oil, kerosene, highly volatile. She pointed to a diagram of the lighthouse layout. The fuel was stored in a separate building, for safety, right here. A stone shed at the base of the tower, on the cliff edge. Liam looked at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. A plan began to form, a wild, suicidal, beautiful plan. It was the first glimmer of agency they had since they arrived. "We cannot starve it," he said, his voice low and intense. "So we burn it." "The lens," Chloe breathed, catching his thought. "The heart." If we can destroy the lens, maybe we can kill it, or at least break its hold on this place. The idea was insane. It was impossible. It required them to leave the relative safety of the cottage, find the fuel, haul what was likely a heavy container all the way to the top of the tower, the place that had almost destroyed them, and somehow set it on fire, all while the creature's puppet was still in the house and Ben was bleeding to death. But it was better than nothing. It was better than sitting here and waiting to die. It was a plan. Okay, Liam said, his mind beginning to race. Okay, the shed. One of us has to go for the fuel. The other stays here with Ben and makes sure that thing stays put. He nodded toward the bookcase. I will go, Chloe said immediately. No, Liam countered. I am the one who is less injured. You stay with Ben. If he wakes up, he will need you, and you know how to tend to his wounds. Chloe looked like she wanted to argue, but she saw the resolve in his eyes. She nodded. There might be more of them out there, she whispered, her mind going back to the scratches on the door, the feeling of things crawling in the walls. The thing on the doorstep might not have been her, I know, Liam said grimly. He would have to be fast. They looked at the door to the tower, the heavy bolted door that led to the staircase. They would have to go through there. Their path to the weapon they needed was right past their trapped enemy. As they sat in the grim silence, cementing the details of their desperate gambit, the hissing from under the bookcase stopped. The sudden absence of the sound was terrifying. Liam instinctively tightened his grip on the poker, raising its tip toward the wreckage. Had it broken free? Had it died? A new sound began. It was soft and sweet and utterly heartbreaking. It was the sound of a woman's voice, humming a gentle, melancholic tune. It was Maya's voice. Not the monstrous chorus voice, but her real voice, exactly as they remembered it. She was humming a wordless lullaby, a little tune she used to hum in their shared college apartment when she was sketching late at night. It was a sound of peace, of comfort, of home. Liam felt his resolve waver. His eyes began to burn. Chloe let out a small, wounded gasp. The creature was changing its tactics. The raw terror had not broken them, so now it was using tenderness. It was trying to disarm them with nostalgia, to poison them with a memory of love. The black clawed hand that had been lying still on the floor began to retract, pulling back slowly under the weight of the bookcase. It disappeared into the shadows. A moment later, another hand emerged in its place. It was a pale, perfect human hand. The nails were clean and short. There were no claws, no wounds, no corruption. It was Maya's hand. It reached out from the darkness under the shattered wood, the fingers stretching, the palm turning upward in a gesture of supplication, of pleading. It was the hand of a victim asking for help. They stared at that hand, at the impossible, perfect limb extending from the monster's prison. It was a lie. They knew it was a lie, but it was a beautiful, compelling one. The humming continued, a melody of grief and memory designed to shatter their hearts. The monster was adapting. It was intelligent. It was reminding them that its greatest weapon was not its claws or its speed, but the stolen face and voice of the friend they had loved. Their time was up. They had to act now, before that song and that hand made them forget what was real. The soft, humming lullaby wrapped around Liam's heart and squeezed. It was a sound of innocence, of lazy afternoons and shared coffee. A sound that had no place in this blood-soaked haunted room. The hand, Maya's hand, lay outstretched, a perfect, pale flower growing from a bed of wreckage and monstrosity. It was the most insidious torture yet. Liam felt his grip on the poker slacken. He saw Chloe, her face streaked with tears and Ben's blood, her expression crumbling under the gentle, relentless assault of the memory. The creature was going to break them with kindness. It was going to kill them with love. No, the thought was a spark in the fog of his grief. No, you do not get her. You do not get to use our love for her as a weapon. He looked at Chloe, and in her eyes he saw the same spark ignite, the same defiant, furious refusal. Her hysterical laughter had been a shield. Now she would turn it into a sword. She took a deep, shuddering breath. "Hey," she said, her voice loud and jarringly cheerful. It cut through the lullaby like a thrown rock. "Hey, Liam, do you remember that time in sophomore year Ben tried to cook a paella in the dorm kitchen?" Liam stared at her, confused for a second before he understood. He saw the wild, desperate intelligence in her eyes. Distraction, defiance, starve the stone. The humming faltered for a beat. The perfect pale hand twitched. He used an entire bottle of paprika. Chloe continued, her voice rising, forcing a laugh that sounded almost real. He called it Spanish surprise. The whole building smelled like a spice rack for a week. And he used gummy worms instead of shrimp because he was too lazy to go to the store. She was laughing for real now, a wild, unhinged torrent of sound. It was the memory, so stupid and mundane and achingly normal. The creature under the bookcase let out a hiss of confusion. The beautiful humming stopped, replaced by a low, angry growl. This was his chance. "Keep going," Liam yelled. He scrambled to the main cottage door, his hands fumbling with the heavy iron bolt. Chloe was on her feet now, pacing, her arms wrapped around herself as if to hold the memories in. "And the road trip to the Grand Canyon," she shouted, her voice echoing in the small cottage. "When we slept in the car and Ben's snoring was so loud we thought it was a bear trying to get in. And Maya painted the sunrise on a napkin with ketchup and mustard." The growling from the bookcase intensified, rising in pitch to that electronic shriek of pain. The outstretched hand spasmed and retracted into the darkness, replaced for a second by the black, twitching talons. It was working. Joy was poison. Happy memories were acid. Liam wrenched the bolt free and pulled the heavy door open. He did not hesitate. He did not look back. He sprinted out into the cold, foggy night. The world outside was a blanket of grey. A thick, wet fog had rolled in off the sea, so dense he could barely see 10 feet in front of him. The air was frigid, and the sound of the waves was a hungry, menacing roar. The storm was returning. He felt 1,000 unseen eyes on him from the swirling mist. He ran, the fire poker held tight in his hand. He followed the faint outline of the path that skirted the base of the tower. The stone shed was a squat, dark shape that loomed suddenly out of the fog. Its door was thick wood, banded with rusted iron. A heavy padlock, eaten away by salt and time, hung from the latch. There was no time for finesse. He wedged the tip of the poker into the gap between the door and the frame, and threw all his weight against it. The wood groaned. The rusted iron shrieked in protest. With a final, desperate heave, the lock shattered and the door scraped open. The shed was small and dark, and it reeked of oil and rust. Stacked against the far wall were 3 large red canisters, the kind used for industrial fuel. They were heavy. He grabbed the handle of one and dragged it toward the door. It was nearly full. As he pulled it over the threshold, a shape materialized in the fog before him. It was the tall, slender silhouette of absolute blackness, the void in the shape of a man he had seen on the rocks. It stood silently in his path, blocking his way back to the cottage. It did not move. It did not make a sound, but a voice flooded his mind, a cold, calm, reasonable voice that sounded like his own. "It is too late, Liam." He saw it in his mind's eye, a vision projected directly into his skull. Ben, lying on the cottage floor, his chest still. Chloe, screaming, as the creature pulled the bookcase away. Maya, her body pale beneath a black, churning sea, her dead eyes open and accusing. "You will fail. They will die. Your fault. Just let go. Lie down. The sea is so peaceful. It will wash all the sorrow away." The pull of it was immense. The promise of an end to the pain, to the struggle. His muscles went slack. The heavy fuel canister slipped from his grasp. It was so easy. Just give up. Ketchup and mustard, he thought. The image, absurd and vivid, cut through the fog of despair. Gummy worms. He saw Chloe's wild, defiant face. He saw Ben, bleeding and broken, using the last of his strength to topple a bookcase. They were not giving up. He would not either. He closed his eyes, shutting out the vision of the black figure. He focused on a memory, a real one, a quiet Sunday morning, years ago, making pancakes in the apartment, the sun streaming through the window, the smell of coffee, Maya humming her little tune, Ben complaining there was not enough bacon, Chloe laughing, stealing a piece from his plate, a simple, perfect, happy moment, not sorrow, not grief, just light. He opened his eyes, held the memory like a shield, and walked forward. He walked right at the black figure. For a moment, he thought he would collide with it, but as he passed through the space where it stood, it dissolved like smoke in the wind. The psychic pressure vanished. He was alone in the fog. He grabbed the canister and ran, his lungs burning, his heart hammering with a new, fierce hope. He burst back into the cottage to find Chloe leaning against the wall, pale and exhausted, her voice gone. Ben was unconscious, but his chest was still rising and falling in shallow breaths. The shrieking from under the bookcase had stopped. It was quiet, waiting. They had no way to carry the huge, heavy canister up the narrow, winding stairs. They found a collection of old glass bottles and a metal bucket in the kitchen, and began the frantic, messy work of decanting the oil. The smell was overpowering, a sharp chemical scent that filled the small space. They worked in silence, their movements urgent. They pushed the heaviest armchair and the dining table against the bookcase, a final, flimsy barricade. It would not hold the creature for long, but they just needed a few more minutes. Liam looked at Ben, his friend, his brother, lying so still. "We are coming back for you," he whispered, a promise to the universe. Then, together, he and Chloe turned to the tower, carrying their sloshing, pathetic bombs. They unbolted the door and stepped back into the heart of the beast. The tower was alive with fury. The humming was a physical blow, a wave of pressure that made their skulls vibrate. The weeping was a wall of sound, the grief of 100 lost souls screaming in their ears. The stairs were slick and treacherous. Cold, spectral hands clawed at them, stronger now, their icy grip catching at their clothes, their ankles. They fought their way upward, driven by a cold, clean rage. There was no more fear. There was only the mission. They reached the lantern room. It was a maelstrom of dark energy. The black light pulsed violently from the lens, and the glass panes that encircled the room were cracking under the strain, long spiderweb fissures spreading across their surfaces. Without a word, they began to work. Liam climbed onto the lens mechanism itself, sloshing the pungent oil over the complex array of prisms, soaking the great glass heart. Chloe moved around the base, pouring the rest of the fuel over the iron housing and the ancient turning gears. The entity made its final stand. With a sound like a thunderclap, the heavy iron door to the walkway blew inward, torn from its hinges. The full force of the hurricane blasted into the room, a screaming wind that threw rain and sea spray everywhere. The ocean itself seemed to be invading the tower, water pouring in, flooding the floor. From the rapidly deepening pool of black water on the iron floor, a figure began to rise. It was Maya's body, twisted and broken, its limbs bent at impossible angles from the crushing weight of the bookcase. However, it was moving. It pulled itself from the water, its black eyes fixing on them, and it began to crawl, dragging its shattered body across the floor. "Liam!" Chloe screamed. He was fumbling with the ignition mechanism, his hands numb with cold, slick with oil. The old spark wheel was rusted and stiff. The crawling thing was halfway across the room, its broken fingers leaving gouges in the iron floor. Chloe, with a cry of revulsion and fury, grabbed the last half-full bottle of oil. She threw it. It shattered at the creature's feet, and she kicked a pool of the liquid toward it, creating a line between them. "Get it lit, Liam!" she screamed. He found the igniter, a small lever-operated wheel. He cranked it. Nothing. The crawling thing was almost upon Chloe. It reached for her, its fingers closing around her ankle. She screamed and kicked at it, but its grip was like a vice. Liam gave the igniter one last desperate turn. A single, defiant spark flew from the wheel. It fell into the oil-soaked heart of the lens. For a fraction of a second, there was nothing. Then, with a deep, liquid whoomph, the world turned white. The lens erupted in a massive, silent fireball. The black light within it did not extinguish. It detonated. A wave of pure, soundless energy blew outward, shattering every pane of glass in the lantern room. The universe-ending shriek of the entity's death agony was a sound felt, not heard, a psychic scream that tore through their minds and then was gone. The top of the lighthouse was a roaring chemical inferno. The blast threw them backward. Liam crashed against the central pillar. Chloe was thrown free of the creature's grasp as its body was instantly consumed by the fire. The entire tower groaned, a deep structural scream of dying stone. It began to shake apart. Out, Liam bellowed, grabbing Chloe's arm and pulling her to her feet. "We have to get out now." They plunged back down the staircase as the tower disintegrated around them. Chunks of stone and molten iron rained down. The steps buckled under their feet. The whole world was noise and fire and violent motion. They burst out of the archway into the cottage. The body of the creature was gone, the space under the bookcase empty. The fire that had destroyed the heart had unmade the puppet. They did not pause. Liam and Chloe grabbed Ben, hooking their arms under his, and dragged him, his body a dead weight, toward the cottage door and out into the raging storm. They collapsed in the mud and weeds 100 yards away, turning back to look at the source of their nightmare. The Salt Weeper's spire, its peak a brilliant torch against the black, stormy sky, leaned. With a final grinding groan that was audible even over the hurricane, the tower broke apart and fell, a cascade of fire and stone, into the churning, furious sea. The waves swallowed it, and with a great hiss of steam, the fire was extinguished, and then silence. The wind died. The rain stopped. The angry roar of the sea softened to a gentle sigh. As the first clean light of dawn broke over the horizon, the storm clouds parted. The sky was a pale, perfect, impossible blue. Liam, Chloe, and Ben lay huddled together on the cliff's edge. Ben's breathing was shallow, but it was steady. They were alive, bruised, burned, and broken beyond all measure, but alive. They had survived. The stone was silent. The echo was starved. The nightmare was over. But as they watched the sun rise over a sea that was for the first time just the sea, they knew the haunting was just beginning.